All right. If I could ask Sujata Gupta and Cindy Malvicini to join me on stage for the opening session, please. Thank you. I'm Rehana Mohideen, and I'm the General Chair for the workshop towards just transition in South Asia, opportunities and challenges for gender equality and social inclusion. And on behalf of the University of Melbourne, I would like to thank the Asian Development Bank for the opportunity to co-organize this workshop. I would now like to call on Sujata Gupta, Director for the Energy Division of the South Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank, to present welcome and opening remarks. Sujata.
Thank you, Rehana. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasant duty to welcome you to this deep dive workshop on towards a just transition in South Asia, opportunities and challenges for gender equality and social inclusion. On behalf of ADB, I would like to thank each and every one of you here for being present in this session. I'm speaking to the converted, right? So we all know a transition to carbon neutral economy is really essential to prevent the world from reaching a tipping point. That's a point where climate change is irreversible. So we have to prevent reaching that crisis situation. And the energy sector is key to the climate change challenge because of the centrality of the fossil fuel use and the creation of carbon emissions. The Asia-Pacific region is expected to play a crucial role in tackling climate change. And as our president, the ADB president, says, that the battle for climate change will be won or lost in the Asia and the Pacific region. So we have a very important responsibility towards a global responsibility, I would say. Therefore, ADB's Strategy 2030, our vision document, prioritizes tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability. And we work with the purpose to enable our DMCs to access cleaner, smarter technologies, promote green economic growth, and make our projects more climate and disaster resilient. Towards this, ADB has committed 75% of its operations by 2030 would support this priority. ADB's Strategy 2030 also equally prioritizes accelerating progress in gender equality and has a target to include at least 75% of its operation by number to incorporate gender elements. So what we're doing here is we have the objective of integrating gender elements into ADB's Clean Energy Transition Program. And hence this session is very relevant. So since 2012, there have been consistent efforts to integrate gender equality and social inclusion in ADB's energy sector portfolio. So this acronym is called, as we all know, GESI, but prior to the meeting, somebody called it Jazzy. So I think it is, but it is equally relevant. So since 2012, just a couple of examples. From 2017 to 2019, the South Asia Regional Department spearheaded the promotion of inclusive energy solutions in South Asia through a series of training events in collaboration with within ADB relevant sectors and thematic groups and the University of Melbourne. Another example, in 2022, again, South Asia's department's JESSI or JASI team has developed a JESSI framework that commits to addressing gender inequalities and other intersecting dimensions of exclusion and vulnerability. So when I say this, I mean exclusion or on the basis of age, disabilities, social identities, sexual orientation, and gender identities, income poverty, and geographic locations, including remote rural and slum populations. So the framework is being rolled out across all sectors, including the energy sector. I'm very pleased to see that the agenda for the session has country-based case studies that are being presented. The lessons learned from this work will be very important to inform a JESSI inclusive, just energy transition. South Asia is also, I think, leading in this aspect as it is the home to innovation, talent, expertise, and resilient communities. And above all, the people here are ready to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the transformation of energy systems and supply chains. I look forward to a successful and productive workshop that will inform and improve our JESSI interventions. And again, thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much, Sujata, for touching on some of the key aspects of the South Asia energy portfolio to frame our discussion and presentations at the workshop this morning. Now I would like to, with great pleasure, introduce our keynote speaker for the workshop. She is Cindy Malvicini, Deputy Director General, Office of the Director General, South Asia Department. And she assumed this position on the 5th of December, 2022. Ms. Malvicini, a national of the United States, holds master's degrees in agriculture, soil and water management from Cornell University, and in intercultural communications from Wheaton Graduate School. Cindy has 31 years of professional experience, including 8 years in the ADB. She joined ADB in February 2005 as an external relations specialist in the former Office of External Relations and was designated as Public Information and Disclosure Specialist in October 2006. She transferred to the South Asia Department as Water Resource Management Specialist in December 2007 and was promoted to Senior Water Resource Management Specialist in May 2010. She was promoted to Principal Portfolio Management Specialist in July 2014. In January 2018, she was appointed Deputy Country Director, Uzbekistan Resident Mission, and was promoted to Country Director in December 2018. She transferred as a Senior Advisor, Central and West Asia Department in April 2022. Prior to joining ADB as staff, she worked as an ADB consultant for the environment, NGOs, and information disclosure policies. She also worked as business process re-engineering specialist and extension associate at Cornell University in the United States. So please give a warm welcome to Cindy Malvicini. Thank you.
Thank you and very good morning. I hope you all have had a very good week and a very pleasant stay in Manila. I'm sure that it's been incredibly hectic. I hope you've gotten a lot of good meetings in and good networking, and you're still ready for another very good day of the ACEF. Thank you for inviting me to present on behalf of the South Asia Department the keynote address for this deep dive workshop and share my insights on the opportunities and challenges for gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI, as Sujata's address nicely explained, within the just energy transition in South Asia. Most countries in the Asia-Pacific region have submitted their updated nationally determined contributions and have enacted policies, plans, and programs to address climate change. But despite significant progress, these efforts are not on track to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement to limit the global temperature increase to between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. There is an urgent need to support countries to actually implement their commitments and then rapidly ramp up ambition and action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially in the energy sector as the largest source of emissions. The unprecedented speed and scale needed to decarbonize the energy sector will inevitably entail significant disruptions and structural changes to our carbon-intensive energy systems and energy supply chains that have been in place for decades. It will also require reimagining how we produce and use energy. This will include moving away from fossil fuels, rapidly deploying renewable energy sources, increasing the uptake of energy efficient technologies, and electrification of end uses. While the net impact of these transformations is positive, there will be groups, communities, regions, and industries that will be adversely affected. The coal mine industry is already a classic example, but we also need to think about energy and transport, energy as input to industrial processes, and how the transition to the entire energy system should be managed. A just transition is a process and an approach that proactively manages the potential risks and negative impacts, maximizes the opportunities to create positive impacts, and ensures that benefits are distributed fairly, and the cost of the transition does not fall on those least able to bear it. With social equity and inclusion as the core tenets of a just transition, it ensures that people, particularly those that are affected and vulnerable groups, can meaningfully participate in, are protected by, and benefit from the deep and rapid changes to come. If a just transition is addressed properly and comprehensively, it will not just unlock increased climate action, but it will also enable inclusive social and economic development and poverty reduction. In the context of South Asia, a just transition can be a net creator of jobs, enhance energy security, address energy poverty and associated gender inequalities, improve air quality, and reduce the burden of disease due to air pollution. A just transition can harmonize and deliver on the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, SDG 10 on reducing inequalities, and SDG 13 on climate action. Feels like we covered most of them there in that list. Across South Asia, the transition toward low carbon energy future is well underway. And our continuing engagements and consultations with our developing member countries indicate there's strong conceptual buy-in for the just component of the transition. The challenge is actually how we implement this component. In 2021, together with other multilateral development banks, ADB committed to a set of high-level principles for just transition. Building on these, our research and our consultation and work with diverse stakeholders, we identified some key elements to make the just transition an institutional priority and to guide ADB's just transition support in the region. These include a coherent policy framework that promotes distributed and procedural justice, robust upstream analysis and data-driven decision-making, solutions tailored to national and local contexts, meaningful stakeholder participation at all levels and stages of the just transition process to achieve a strong social consensus, and the adoption of intersectoral approaches in planning and implementation. A GESI-sensitive and just transition will involve universal access to quality energy services to adhere to the principle of no worker and community left behind. Workers in industries that need to be transitioned away from should have social protection, including alternative and satisfactory employment options, which may involve reskilling. We must carefully address gender employment gaps, including ensuring women employment in STEM industries. Affected groups must be part of the decision-making and processes and leadership structures during this just transition. And this requires using traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge. Some of these considerations have been addressed through our GESI mainstreaming interventions in the SARD energy sector portfolio, some examples of which will be presented and discussed during today's deep dive. The purpose of this workshop is to draw lessons from these initiatives, build on those lessons, and further develop this work as part of the just energy transition in South Asia. We also want to identify the opportunities and challenges for GESI in the clean energy transition based on international experiences and promising good practices applicable to South Asia. ADB envisions a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable South Asia sub-region and Asia-Pacific region. And a GESI-sensitive and just energy transition is integral to realizing this vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for identifying some of the key elements of a GESI-sensitive and just transition. And a very big thank you to our two guests for taking time out of very hectic schedules and for joining us. We truly appreciate it. And I hope we have adequately shown our appreciation to you this morning. Thank you very much. All right, now I'd like to call on Pradeep Tarakan, Energy Transition Director for the Asian Development Bank, to get stuck into session one. Pradeep.
Thank you, Rehana, and good morning, everybody. I think we should go straight into the panel discussion. We are running a little bit short on time. So as Sujata and Cindy mentioned earlier, just transition is simply the sentiment that we ensure that no one's left behind. And if we don't plan for it and work on it, there's a real risk that we might create a just transition divide, similar to what we see with the digital divide in the digital world. So with that, let me welcome, we've got a fantastic panel here. Let me welcome our three speakers onto the stage to join me here. Please welcome Mr. Chandrabhushan, CEO for iForest. We've got ADB's own Kate Hughes, Senior Climate Specialist, and we've got Ms. Balada Moore from the World Bank, all the way from the Big Durian, Jakarta. And what we want to do with this panel and this session is to really provide you with a historical perspective of just transition origins, some of the work that's been gone on in different parts of the world. This is not a new concept. It's been around since the 90s. So there are lessons to be learned already. But then each region is different and brings with its own challenges with it. So without any further delay, let me welcome Mr. Chandrabhushan. Thank you.
I have a presentation, if someone can help me with that. Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you, Rehana. Thank you, Pradeep, ADB, for getting us here, because my colleague Srishta is also here. She'll talk about gender aspect. What I am going to do in a couple of minutes is to give you a sense about who we are and what work we do, as well as some of our work on capturing international experience on just transition. Now, people say, what is just transition? How do you define it? I think Shindy said it very rightly. It is energy transition plus SDG. That's it. You take energy transition, you put all the goals of sustainable development, goals, SDGs, and just transition provides an integrated framework to implement these things together with people at the center, affected community at the center. That's what just transition is. And this is how world is looking at just transition, an integrated framework to meet a lot of our sustainable development goals, to achieve net zero with affected community at the center. Now, okay, I'm struggling again.
You have to point to Tuvalu. It's a geography lesson. Where is Tuvalu?
Okay, where? Oh,
The sensors at Tuvalu.
okay.
On the left side.
The presentation has to,
There's a bit of a lag.
okay.
IT system.
So everyone is, okay. Give you a sense about who we are. We are a Delhi-based environmental think tank, and we work at the intersection of environment and development. Just Transition is a big program of the center, iForest, and we have set up a part of iForest as India Just Transition Center. As you can see, over the last 3 years, one of the big work we have done is to generate new knowledge on just transition. What does it mean? And what would it entail? And therefore, we have done subnational studies, district level study, in fact, sub-subnational studies. We have looked at legal and regulatory framework on just transition. And I have few publications that I have here, and lucky if you can get 1 or 2 copies of the publication. The latest one is what we have done for G20, which is we have just submitted to G20 guidelines and frameworks that G20 should adopt on just energy transition. That's the latest publication that we have done. Now, if you look at the world and you type a keyword called just transition, you start getting few broad ideas what just transition looks like. The first, it is very coal-centric. So everyone is talking about just transition in terms of coal. They're not talking about in terms of oil and gas, though it is equally applicable to oil and gas. So first of all, it is very coal-focused. Second, right now, there are 16 countries across the world who are working on just transition. They have some form of national policy or program on just transition. But the most interesting thing is actually happening at the subnational level. There are 50 plus subnational plans that are being implemented that are at various stages of implementation on just transition. Obviously, the big one are the territorial just transition plan of the European Union, but that's not all. There are subnational plans being implemented in 3 states of US, 1 province of Canada, South Africa with JETP has started looking at just transition plan. Indonesia is supposed to come up with just transition plan. So there is a lot that is happening at the subnational level. And if you put all of them together, they account for about 25% of global coal production right now. So we are at very initial stage of addressing just transition to the entire energy basket. We have already excluded oil and gas. Europe, which is very focused on just transition, somehow doesn't want to touch gas. And I find it very, very, very surprising that why you are only focusing on coal, whereas your dependence on gas is actually increasing, nevertheless. But this is what is the big picture of just transition. Now, if you put all the plans together, there are 7 or 8 key learnings that are there. The first is everyone is focused on closing old mines and old thermal power plants. And therefore, countries with largest stock of old plants and mines are moving ahead. That's again why Europe is focusing on coal. Because Europe, the average age of thermal power plant in Europe is about 40 years, 45 years. The average age of thermal power plant in India is 12 years. In China, it will be about 15 years. So Asia has a very new fleet of thermal power plant compared to developed world, where these fleets are very old. And therefore, these plants have already paid their capital, their depreciated assets, and very easy to therefore decommission. So we also have to keep thinking how economics will play in just transition, especially the value of asset, what role it is going to play. The other thing you find is that countries who have moved ahead have set up independent task force to design just transition. And most countries have done that. Independent Just Transition Task Force have done good work. They have allowed the governments to chart much clearer path on just transition. The most important thing you find is that everyone is struggling with reforming existing laws and regulation from the perspective of just transition. And I'll take a minute to explain why it is. Over the last 100 years, most of the legal framework has been developed to establish new facilities. So you have environmental impact assessment to set up new plant. But there is no legal framework, in fact, very little legal framework other than mining and nuclear power plant to decommission a facility. So countries are struggling, for example, to get new legal frameworks on closing industrial establishment, and then to deal with labor and social consequences of that closure. So laws and regulations, reforming laws and regulations are becoming a big bottleneck. The responsibilities are very clear. Everyone is following this model of national government being responsible for national framework and getting financial resources, and subnational governments implementing it. The interesting part is most countries are not giving responsibility of implementing just transition to existing administrative setup. It is so complicated that everyone is setting up new implementation mechanism on just transition. And similar for Europe, and we found the same thing in the US as well as in Canada. The only difference is that the only thing that has been given to the existing administrative setup is to provide supporting role. But there are new institutions being set up to implement just transition. The last point is, though everyone talks about social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, the outcome is not very clear. What role these dialogues have played in designing the just transition framework, even with respect to task force. Much more in terms of South Africa, because we were deeply involved in understanding how South Africa has developed its just transition investment plan. And we did not see evidence of stakeholders influencing the outcome of South Africa plan. I'll just take a minute to explain to you. This is another work that we are doing on financing just transition. And these are the cost components that are becoming important in just transition. So there are about 8 cost components that countries are taking into consideration in developing the investment plan for just transition. Mine reclamation, repowering of thermal power plant, labor support, economic diversification, community resilience, green energy investment, revenue substitution, and energy price support. Many of these fossil fuel regions provide subsidy to industries and communities, and planning and governance. These are the 8 cost components that are there. But again, investments are highly region specific, and the financial packages are a politically negotiated outcome. Now, this prompted us, and we are going to publish our report very soon, to come out with an empirical framework on costing just transition. Just want to give you a sense. We have just done this study for India on how much it would cost for India to phase out its existing fleet of coal-based thermal power plant and coal mines. And as you can see, it is about $1 trillion investment that would be required. And about 40–45%, in fact, close to 50%, is to substitute the existing energy infrastructure. So if you want a district or a region to close a coal mine, you have to give something in return. And we assume that green energy investment will happen there. Then 50% of that money is going to go for substituting the existing infrastructure. The interesting part is that the labor, we keep talking about, you know, the labor component of just transition, but that cost is actually not very high. You know, it's less than 5%, and rightly so, because your major investment is going into economic diversification and setting up new energy facility. Labor is not that high. Revenue substitution also is not very high. You know, we initially thought that these fossil fuels, you know, infrastructure must be providing a lot of revenue to the state and subnational government, but that amount is not very high. So this is how it looks like. Let me give you the fast from our study of 3 years of number of reports that we have done. We think there are 6 parts to just transition, and we are calling it as 6 R's of just transition. The core of just transition is going to be the restructuring of the economy of fossil fuel regions, because these are fossil fuel centric economies. So one, restructure the economy. Second is repurpose the existing land and infrastructure. You don't want to destroy new parcel of forest to set up renewable energy plant. So repurpose land and infrastructure, reskill and skill for the new industry, develop resilience to existing shock as well as climate change, revenue substitution, and lastly, do it in a much more responsible manner than what we have done in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chandrabhushan. I would encourage all of you to look up the reports that he presented. These are really pioneering assessments, and ADB is quite pleased to be working with iForest in India, where we've just begun to do some detailed granular assessments of the needs so that can inform our future programming. With that, let me move on to Kate Hughes, ADB's own Kate Hughes, who's going to talk to us about how ADB is preparing to help its clients on just transition matters. Thanks.
Okay, good morning. So good to be here. So I think some of what I was going to say, Chandra's already covered, so I'll build on that. But I think we've seen really the concept of just transition really start to gain traction in the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, it was there in the Paris Agreement, but the momentum around the discussion has really only started to pick up in that time. And we're now at a stage where the word energy transition has changed to the word just energy transition. But the question is whether we're actually taking account of that just part properly. And I think there's very broad conceptual agreement that we need to do just transition. But in terms of how we actually operationalize that and how we actually bring that into ADB programs and other programs is still where a lot of work needs to be done. I think one of the dangers with just transition is it is such a multi-dimensional agenda. And as Cindy pointed out, there's many SDGs that it can touch on. But if it becomes too big, then we won't be able to implement it. And there is a danger that it starts to move towards good social development as a broader concept. And so making sure that we tie it back to the net zero agenda and tie it back to the drivers of climate action are really important in order to be able to take it forward. It doesn't mean we don't need to continue development, and institutions like ADB have a long history of that. But in terms of looking specifically at just transition programming, policy, and projects in countries, we need to make sure that those drivers related to climate action are there. Just transition started very much as a labor movement. It was the unions that advocated for it to be included with the ILO into the Paris Agreement. But it has started to migrate. And as Chandra pointed out, now depending on the stakeholders, there's very different perspectives on it. So you have that community-based approach, affected people, a lot of, NGOs, CSOs coming in from that perspective and really managing social impacts. You then have a different set of stakeholders that are looking from a kind of macroeconomic perspective in terms of these shifts in economy, what type of macro labor shifts, what type of energy security, energy price concerns. And then, as directly relevant today, another example is the gender perspective. So how can we fit the gender equality perspective into the just transition perspective? And that's perhaps a different set of stakeholders that are working on it. I think for ADB, we're doing a lot of work at the moment developing our operational approach or institutional agenda to just transition. So how do we actually roll it out? And there's some important aspects. First, it's very context specific. So, when we look at different countries, different regions, different districts within countries, there's a lot of different factors that influence how a just transition will play out. I think secondly, it's not a risk mitigation agenda. Obviously, it's very important that we need to anticipate and manage social impacts, but we also need to see what are those opportunities for green economic diversification, for creation of jobs, for decent and greener jobs. And for ADB, that means that we need to take the perspective of supporting just transition as an enabling intervention. So although it does cross over with our safeguards a lot, it's more about enabling that positive side of the net zero transition rather than a risk mitigation approach for projects. And as part of that, ensuring that gender perspective is taken in is a really important aspect of our just transition. We see this opportunity to transform our economies and societies. So can we also take this as an opportunity to promote gender equality and address some of the issues that we have? So for ADB, we look at just transition, we think about direct, indirect, and induced impacts. So this diagram here, we call it the onion diagram. Many of you have probably already seen it before, but it's a way to try to conceptualize how just transition goes beyond that direct impact. So down at the asset level, we have asset level impacts. If you're going to do a project or if a coal power plant is going to close, you have those direct workers, indirect workers, employers, labor unions, environmental issues, and communities are immediately around the project. But to really look at just transition planning for either a province or even a country, then you need to go out from that asset level, start to think about how impacts travel along supply chains or even travel through economy, what type of induced impacts you may get from lost government revenue, what type of alternative employment is available to take those lost workers, what are the potentials for economic diversification, and then spanning out from that, at that national level, what is the geopolitical context? What's the fossil fuel export of that country? How are you going to get those macro shifts? What are the policy frameworks? What are the education systems? And then at the regional level, in terms of coordination across programs and stakeholders that are working. And that's where we see, regional and national platforms such as the JETP coming in. So I think, there's a number of different frameworks and approaches that different organizations are doing to try to articulate how to think about just transition. Because it is so multidimensional and complex, then people are struggling to, that haven't been working in it, to understand how to put it into a framework. So I think Chandra shared your 6 Rs, was it? 6 Rs. There's another framework that, for example, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism has a framework for private sector finance. The Grantham Institute's done some work. World Bank, Balada, they have a 3x3 framework for just transition. But you'll see that most of them have very similar elements. It's just a different way to try to organize the thoughts around how we approach just transition. For ADB, we are in the process of developing our framework, and we have 4 key pillars that we use to articulate how we approach it. So the first is on that the negative impacts of climate interventions are managed. So that we want to support countries to do upstream analysis, to do planning, to understand what potential socioeconomic impact may be from interventions and how they can put in place mitigating interventions. And one of the key aspects of that is that the finance and support for that will actually need to come ahead of when the finance and support for decarbonisation. So for example, if you want to support jobs generation or economic diversification or skilling of workforce, that finance and those projects may need to come into a region ahead of when the projects for the decarbonisation come. The second is around that positive opportunity aspect. So understanding that Paris-aligned long-term development pathways create opportunities. So how can we help countries to capitalize on those opportunities and look for new sectors, new supply chains, new critical minerals, which is one of Pradeep's pet topics. So how can we position countries to take advantage of those opportunities? The third is policy and institutions that support a just transition. And Chandra gave a lot of examples about how specific planning authorities are being established. So how do you ensure that all the policies in a country and all the institutions in a country work coherently together? And we're seeing some issues arise with that, where the institutions and the policy holders for some of those social dimensions are not necessarily coordinated and involved from the outset in the discussion on energy transition. So often the energy transition discussion will be with ministries of economy, ministries of finance, and the energy ministries. But those labor ministries, gender ministries, those core social are not necessarily there in the discussion from the beginning. So, and then the last pillar is about transparency and stakeholder engagement, which we've also discussed. But it's really about how we go for participatory planning processes rather than consultation on policy and work that's done. And I'm running out of time, but just quickly on that. So if, for example, in Indonesia, there's a lot of work ongoing now in the development of the JETP on how we really do those engagement processes properly. ADB launched a Just Transition support platform at COP last year. It has technical assistance resources available to support countries on upstream analysis, on policy dialogue, stakeholder engagement. And it's a very multidisciplinary team of experts that are available. So any countries looking for support on Just Transition, please come and see us. And longer term aim by 2025 is to look at a financing facility that can provide finance for Just Transition. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Let me now welcome Balada Amor from the World Bank to talk to us about the bank's work. As Kate mentioned, ADB and the World Bank have been collaborating across Asia in specific countries on developing just transition efforts.
Thank you so much, Pradeep, and thank you for all the panelists preceding me. I'm waiting for my slide to come up. While we wait, perhaps I'll just give a bit of an intro. So I think the setup of the panelists today is really, really great. So thank you so much for the organizing committee. To Rehanna, thank you so much for bringing us together, because as Kate mentioned, she was building on Pradeep's presentation, and I'm going to build on Kate's presentation to show some example case studies from Indonesia. There we are. So as Kate was mentioning, there are different types of just transition frameworks around the world, but basically we are the same. So we all want to focus on people, communities, and local workers, help the governments at the national and subnational government to be able to implement the just energy transition programs properly. So what we're doing with the Indonesian government at the moment is we're starting the dialogue and intensifying this dialogue, especially because the JETP initiative is already rolled out in Indonesia. So if you remember the 4 core pillars that Kate was presenting, preceding that design of a just transition framework, it is important to really do our homework. What I mean by homework is that we really have to work together with the government and all the stakeholder groups to prepare just transition baseline analytics. So what we're doing at the moment, we're conducting a review and analysis of the coal landscape in Indonesia, trying to understand all the different elements and particles that are related to coal transition in a country like Indonesia. Because if we understand that we are planning for a coal plant decommissioning or early retirement, that would eventually, of course, then impact the entire coal value chain up until the upstream side, which is the mining sector, as Chandra also presented briefly in his presentation. So the second task for us to do is to conduct a stakeholder mapping of national and subnational stakeholders. And we really want to catch those perceptions of the different stakeholders, making sure that we really understand their concerns, their pain points, their rejections, if any, against this discussion of an energy transition, and understand the history and background of why this is all happening. The third is a socioeconomic impact analysis, or potential socioeconomic impact analysis, to be more precise. So we want to work together with our development partners, with our local partners at the subnational level, as well as in the coal regions in Indonesia, to really see and calculate qualitatively as well as quantitatively conduct a statistical analysis to know whether and who will be really adversely impacted throughout this transition process. The fourth is a governance and implementation model analysis. If you remember, Chandra was also mentioning one of the important parts of a just transition is to see who will be implementing it, right? So there can be a designing entity or agency in that certain government or country, and there can be the implementing agency, which can be the subnational governments as well. In this case, we'll be looking at different case studies across the countries where the World Bank had been already active and proactively helping in the just transition process. So we're going to see those different case studies and see whether Indonesia would be able to have their own type of a just transition committee or workforce or task group, or rather see whether there's already an existing agency that we need to support and emphasize further. And last but not least, we have a labor force analysis, which is, of course, ultimately one of the most important analysis that we need to do. We need to see whether these workers in the coal plants that are going to be early retired, or the workers in the coal mines, whether they are going to be reskilled or transitioned into other types of work. We need to identify potential economic diversification in those areas and make sure that everybody is part of this whole decision-making process and that nobody is left behind. Great, so the clicker is working perfectly. Here is an interesting find. I just bring up this map of East Kalimantan and South Sumatra. So on the left-hand side, you'll see East Kalimantan. Based on our GIS mapping, we see that if you can see clearly, there are those circles. That's where the mining operations are taking place. Now, the larger the circles, of course, the more intensive the mining activities are, or the bigger the mining operations are. And then the green shades and the crimson and orange and red shades are the IDM, or the index of the development of that village. So the level of the development rate of the villages around the mine sites. We see in East Kalimantan that there is a very strong correlation between the level of the development of the villages to the size of the mining operations, or the intensity of the mining operations, which shows that the community there would be highly dependent on the coal mines. But impressively, on the other hand, it is a contrast. So in South Sumatra, you see where there is a concentration of mining sites there in the middle, but everywhere across South Sumatra, the villages are more developed. So it really does not show that correlation, that where there is a mine site, the villages would then be automatically more developed than the others. So what this means, and this shows us, it is interesting that there are different characteristics of coal mining communities and coal regions in Indonesia, and supposedly, I think, perhaps across the world as well. So the next deep dive that we need to do is, of course, really understand what is the root cause of these differences of the coal characteristics, coal community characteristics, and in coal regions in Indonesia. Now, this is the part where I'd like to dive deeper into the layer of the gender observation. So women representation in Indonesia's coal and energy industry is somewhat low or very low still in number. We did a very quick analysis, and we also worked together with the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. They presented us with the data on their own workforce. On the very left-hand side of the box, we see that only 21% women employees are part of the director or similar level at that ministry, and even less so, of course, in the higher level of the DG, Director General, and the minister level. In the middle, you'll see an average percentage of female representation in Indonesia's coal supply chain in the year 2022. So across the different types of businesses or organizations, you'll see it's a very, very low percentage, 10%, 16%. And we also heard yesterday from the presentation of Ibu Cynthia of PLN. She did mention that there was around 19% of women employees in PLN at the moment, and even lesser, 15% of the women sitting in the managerial and higher level in PLN. So that means that there is a lot of work for us to do as well, and help each other to try to reach gender equality in Indonesia and close the gender gap. On the very right-hand side, there is women in ASM sector as one of our studies that we did with WIME, which is a Women in Mining and Energy, that is a local CSO in Indonesia. So we did a project in Sawalunto, West Sumatra, and we wanted to map the impacts of the COVID-19 during that hard time of a pandemic. And we see the female miners there. They were heavily burdened by additional tasks to then become the breadwinners of the families. So you see that women are sometimes more innovative and creative compared to their peers. During this very hard time, they had to take over the role of their partners when the husbands lost their jobs as coal miners. So they became burdened by the triple responsibilities as a breadwinner, household caretaker, and also caring for their children and their families. This, I think, will be my last slide. Notwithstanding, we do see opportunities for a more gendered just transition in Indonesia. So there are policies in place. It's very good policies and strong to gender mainstream any activities taking place in Indonesia, starting from the state level, corporate level, all the way down to the subnational level. The question is, of course, how are they implemented and enforced, right? So somebody needs to monitor that. That is part of the top-down approach, including some very, very good initiatives that we've collected here. Guerrilla is also one of them. It is an initiative to help accelerate the inclusion of women, young graduates to also be active and find jobs in RE companies in Indonesia. It is a collaboration between MEMR, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, with USAID, and also with the Ministry of Environment. Patriot Energy is also one of the good initiatives taken care of by the ministry. Also helping young graduates to be part of the pioneers, to be there in the frontier remote areas of Indonesia and find opportunities to implement renewable energy generation for acceleration of electrification. And then we have the Sri Kandi. We've heard that also from our friends from PLN in the past 2 days. Sri Kandi PLN is part of the Sri Kandi BUMN, which is the Ministry of State-Owned Enterprise. And they're also very advanced in their thinking and making sure that the gender gap is closed as soon as possible. Now, what's more interesting is on the right-hand side, of course, are the bottom-up approaches. So these are women-led initiatives, including women in energy, mining and energy, as I mentioned earlier. And then we have Yayasan Tambuhak Sinta, which is a locally led organization helping local communities, especially women. So they identify women organizations and cooperatives and empower them to be able to be more independent and be sustained in their livelihood. Last we have here on the list is the Gardens of the Sun. This is a really interesting small enterprise led by a woman in Kalimantan. So she helps the female gold miners there to implement good mining practices and principles, and even upskill them through training so they will be able to to create gold jewelry. So they craft their own jewelry, and she provides the access into international markets in the European countries, as well as you can find some of their products in Bali and Indonesia if you have time to visit Bali. So I guess that's the last of my presentation. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Balada. Who's got time to visit Bali? That's an easy question. So Professor Rehana, I need to ask, we're running way behind time, but I also feel bad not having opened it up for questions. So should we, pun intended, transition? One or two questions, pressing questions, other than how to get to Bali? Any pressing questions? I mean, we've got a wonderful panel here. Go ahead, please. Identify yourselves and make it a very quick, straight question, no comments.
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Ragini from Caspian Debt. I want an example of how Just Transition has been implemented, even a small pilot, what it looks like, what success looks like.
We'll be looking at some of that in session 2.
Yeah, so any quick response, but there'll be more of it in session 2.
Well, there are number of case studies in Europe. I will not call them as successful case studies because, for example, Ruhr in Germany is a celebrated case, but if you go and talk to people there, you find that they still remain depressed area of Germany. So is the steel and coal mining in Belgium, Netherlands. All the old European coal mine and steel areas where, quote unquote, some sort of transition planning went into reviving those areas have not been very successful. Similar is the case with the coal areas of Pennsylvania in the US, the large coal mining areas. So we have learned a lot from what mistakes were done, but I will not be able to give you one successful example. That will be very difficult for me to give it to you.
There is one, it's underway, but there's a region in Western Australia called the Collie region. They have a very good website on their Just Transition initiative, has a trust fund set up by the state government. It then has like a collaborative committee that's made up of local residents, business leaders, unions, the government, that looks at how to invest that trust fund. It's a coal mining region in Western Australia. They've now attracted new businesses. For example, the manufacturer of emergency vehicles, fire engines and all of that for that region has moved to that town, and they've reskilled coal mining workers to move there. So we don't have much time, but it's an interesting example. They even have a community podcast on community radio to inform everyone what's happening.
Thanks. Just very, very brief. So World Bank has put out a publication. You can look it up in the website of the World Bank. There are 2 recent publications on supporting coal regions in transition. And there are some examples of good case studies there that you may want to look up. Thanks.
Yeah, and just briefly support before we take the next question, and this will be the last one, is that if you look at the EU auditor's report, just to substantiate what Chandra said, they've come out pretty strongly to say that much of the coal just transition work was heavily funded by the EU, hasn't really led to just transition or to clean energy development. So that's a pretty, damning endorsement of that whole. So that's available online. You can look at those reports to see what went wrong. So yes, please, the last question before we really transition on.
Hi, this is Usha from Nepal. I have a very small question. I would say, like, at the really micro level, in the just transition, I can imagine the worst hit would be the workers. And I can imagine it's not only reskilling and skilling, it's a lot of things to do in change in mindset. It's also families related to the workers. And I can imagine it could be a lot of migrant workers in these mines. So I would like the panelists and others who are working in this sector to keep that in mind and have the planning done properly on those aspects. Thank you. It's
Great,
not a question,
great.
it's a kind of
Thank you.
comment.
Thank you for the comment. Thanks so much. Okay, Rihanna, back to you. And thank you so much to the panelists. Please join me in giving them a big round of applause.
Could I ask the panelists for session 2 to come up, please? So we can get stuck into it. And this is where we start to look at some of the case studies about on this just transition, drawing from the South Asia Department energy portfolio and some of the initiatives to mainstream gender equality and social inclusion in the SAD portfolio. Now, we've packed this session with presentations and so on, but I think that's fine. It's really good to hear from some of the experts doing the work. If people bear with me, we might take a few minutes into the tea session as a tea break as well, so that we can take a few more question and answers at the end. So the first speaker is James Kolantharaj, who's a senior energy specialist for the South Asia Department of the ADB, and he'll be talking about the work done under the POISED project in the Maldives, which focuses on distributed generation. And we'd like to put this forward as a case study in a GESI sensitive and just energy transition. James Kolantharaj.
Thank you, Rahana, and also for inviting me for this panel. How many of you in this room are still confused of energy transition and just transition? Actually, I am still. So actually, I will just move to the next slide. Actually, these are the few buzzwords we used to say during the last decade: mitigation, adaptation, net zero, carbon neutral, all these words. And now we talk about just transition, sustainable transition, equitable transition. All these words are coming up. I was still trying to learn the previous buzzwords. Now new words came up, right? So this is the reality now. And basically, I'm an engineer. Basically many of I don't know how many of us in this room are engineers, because I used to hate Fourier transforms and Laplace series. So actually these all look like Fourier transform and Laplace series to me. So basically, I'm going to, trying to relate some of the activities ADB has done in these areas, probably climate. I'm trying to relate this to, energy transition or a just transition. And the two projects I have mentioned in the below, POISED, Preparing Outer Islands for Sustainable Energy Development, which is a project which is almost completing implementation, and the Advanced project. The other one is Accelerating Sustainable System Using Renewable Energy. And just to give a brief, this is the first project, the POISED project, which actually made a fundamental transformation in Maldives, introducing renewable energy battery hybrid systems across 160 outer islands. I think I can't even identify any country or any SIDS nation who has implemented hybrid systems across so many small islands. And I'm not going to go into details because this is not time to go into technical discussions. And the next one, the Assure project, which is the next phase of the earlier project, which is the POISED project, where we are going to do accelerating the renewable energy penetration and facilitating private sector participation, and also, also introducing new technologies and also engaging communities in certain interventions. And this, whatever we have done in Maldives, of all the entire energy sector portfolio, I can always relate to energy transition. The first one I already mentioned, the fundamental shift towards RE from fossil fuel, mainly diesel. And the second one, Assure, we accelerate the RE penetration and engaging private sector. And these are real transition. Some of the photographs, which is taken from ground in Maldives, actually. And I will move to the next slide. Actually, from the technical point of view, we have done solar PV battery hybrid systems with an optimal design covering 160 islands. And we supported cross-sectoral interventions. solar PV, battery-based ice making plants, which is to support fisheries, which is the second largest economic activity in Maldives. And we are also supporting the first solar PV ferry, which is to support transport, which is the second largest consumer of diesel. And we are also supporting agricultural activities through pilots, and which I'll which I'll come through later. And we're also supporting innovative and emerging technologies, which is mainly ocean-based technologies, small wind, and advanced storages, which is 3C batteries and flow batteries, which has higher potential in the future. And when we do the project, actually, what are the activities we have done beyond the project? So that's what we are going to explain here. We have done a public outreach program. This project started implementation in 2015, and none of these outer islanders know what solar PV is. So actually, then we started with a public outreach or awareness campaign. Then we also got a strong support from the community. This has been covering 115 islands so far covered, covering 700 participants. About 50% of them are women. And going to the next slide, okay, not only just the community, but also including the future generation. We also provide career guidance sessions for students covering from grade 8 to grade 10 and 12 grades, and also covering these outer islands and covering over around 7,000 students. And we also provide RE training and community empowerment programs for women, and where they identify opportunities to use renewable energy. So far they have started implementing rooftop solar program using net metering. They are already harnessing the benefits of renewable energy. And one more example is providing opportunities through the utilities which ADB can leverage using providing employment. So in renewable energy, that has been one of the areas we have been supporting, and also energy efficiency, which is mainly through distributed LED bulbs, which has been an ongoing government program, and we facilitated that as well. Actually, these are interventions which has never been consciously built in the process of the project. These are interventions which came along with the project during the engagement with the community. So we understand that the community needs ice. So the first solar-powered ice making plant in one of the islands was built, and this was entirely operated by the island community, which is especially the women development community, actually. So what is a good? The solar PV is owned by the utilities, which we support, and the ice making plant is owned by community. This is a very sustainable initiative where the ice making plant provides sustainable income to the community, where the solar PV provides free electricity to the utilities. So, in a way, this is to support the fisheries, which is not directly to support power sector. Similarly, actually, replicating the success of the previous one, we have also implemented going to implement 4 more solar-powered ice-making plants covering 4 more islands, which have bigger capacity, which is requested by the government, actually, seeing the success of the previous intervention. And we are now preparing another just transition intervention, understanding the requirement from the community that first renewable energy-based reverse osmosis plant, supporting irrigation with the modern irrigation systems, and also to support agriculture. And I'm just moving to the next slide. I know time is okay. The lessons and opportunities, the previous speakers spoke about the energy transition and just transition. It should be country specific or even state specific or city specific. And we no need to wait for large scale transition to come up and identify areas which can be, which we can go for immediate intervention rather than waiting for a bigger program to come in. And I'm actually taking the words from Rahana from the opening session. I like it very much, actually. The grounding floating ideas, into interventions is very important, and replicate successful interventions and share those experiences with everyone. And until the grounding or until the floating ideas are never grounded, and the transition is never going to be real. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, James. And we will be documenting this project as a case study in a GESI sensitive just energy transition. Now, I'd like to call on our speakers from Sri Lanka, Kamini Jayasekara, Deputy General Manager of the Ceylon Electricity Board in Sri Lanka, and Upali Darnagama, former Additional Secretary of the Ministry of Power and an ADB consultant. And here we've got a bit of a historical perspective, looking at some of the lessons drawn from achieving 100% electrification in Sri Lanka.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you, ADB, for having me here today. I'm Kamini Jayasekara. I'm Additional General Manager in charge of one of the distribution divisions of the Ceylon Electricity Board, Sri Lanka. So the topic given is on the road to achieving full electrification and the lessons learned for a just energy transition. So when we talk about I will quickly take you through the journey of the 100% of the achieving 100% electrification in Sri Lanka. So when you talk about the Ceylon Electricity Board, that is the government-owned utility, it is vertically integrated, which is responsible for nearly major part of the distribution in Sri Lanka. There's another distribution company called Lanka Electricity Company, but they operate mainly in the town areas. When you talk about rural electrification, it's a responsibility of the National Electricity Utility, that is Ceylon Electricity Board. So we have been doing this electrification as a responsible electricity utility. Far back in 1980, the electrification level was only 10%. So the government took an initiative to go for an accelerated electrification program. So we set up a dedicated unit within CEB for rural electrification. That was in 1980. That time electrification level was only 10%. So we got the support of many lending agencies. The contribution of Asian Development Bank is quite significant among other lending agencies. Let me just, okay, that's fine. Right, this is the whole list of lending agencies who supported us during this journey. By 1990, we achieved only 20%. So government took various policy decisions to accelerate this program, because since we are getting funding from lending agencies, we have to go by their guidelines. We were only implementing economically and financially viable schemes. So the government stepped in and they bridged the gap to implement the uneconomical schemes also. So that's why, the government target was to achieve 100% electrification by 2012, but it went up to 2016. We managed to achieve that target 2016. When you talk about rural electrification, it's quite difficult in a place like ours. Just first one. Upal will go through. Because rural population is scattered, and they are low income group, and terrains are difficult. So we had all these difficulties taking the national grid to this village level. But we managed to do that. For some cases, we had to set up grid substations and also medium voltage lines. So we pumped a lot of money, not just for the low voltage lines, but so we had to take the entire grid to these levels. So when we, by 2016, we achieved this 100% electrification level. So when I just touch upon the generation mix within Sri Lanka, so we have coal power plants and oil, and also renewable energy. So in 1999, actually 100% our generation, the energy came from hydro. That is 100% renewable when we were in 1999. So then that's the only indigenous major resource within Sri Lanka. Then after that, so we had to go for coal and other oil-based power plants. Now the share is coal is 30%, oil 15%, the balance even today, our renewable share is 55%. So it came down from 100 to 55. Now the government has taken initiative to go back to 70%. So there's a rigorous solar implementation program and also wind power. So those are the other indigenous renewables we have, solar and wind. Rooftop schemes are in place. So the government is providing various support in promoting these renewable energy schemes. So the target is going back to from 55 to 70 in the near future. Now we have expanded the grid to the entire country is covered, but we cannot stop at that point because we need to improve the quality of the supply. So we have put the quantity, but we need to improve the quality. So we need to constantly pump money, invest in to improve the quality of this supply given to the people. One other thing we found, I mean, even if the grid is extended, people were not getting connected to the national grid. The reason was, I mean, still they could not afford to get this electricity. So the electricity was brought to their doorstep up to 50 meters. Then government formulated another scheme to give loans for this connectivity and also for even house wiring. So it was formulated as a loan and put it into the electricity bill, and they were allowed to pay in installments through the electricity bill. So with all these schemes, now we have achieved 100% electrification, and the generation mix, that we are a small system. The total installed capacity around 4,000 megawatts. The generation mix I mentioned, this coal power plant is only 10 years old. So it has some useful lifetime to go. So there's another case study or the post-evaluation, the impact to analyze the impact of this rural electrification, how it has helped the rural community, again assisted by the Asian Development Bank. My colleague Upali Dharnagam will continue from there. He will give you the details of the findings of that study. Thank you.
Thank you. Upali, I think you've got about a minute for the next two slides. Thank you.
I would like to highlight few cases, the impact of RE related to the just transition. As a result of basically because of the RE extension, the transmission grid as well as the medium voltage grid was developed all over the country. So as a result of this extension of the transmission grid and the medium voltage network, there's a rapid development of distributed generation all over the country. And this shows, the graph shows the development of small distributed generation from various renewable resources. So during the last 2 decades. So this is a significant development. Actually, the 10% of total generation comes from these small generators. This is the geographical distribution of various resources. It's almost equally distributed all over the country. This green is power generation from dendro plants. It's in the central part of the country. It's mostly hydro, and the solar, it's in most of the areas, and wind basically on the northeastern part. And then just one slide on a comprehensive survey carried out by us to assess the impact of rural electrification. What you see on the top left is clearly shows the increase of income levels in the community. So we compared the 2016 survey results with a similar survey carried out in 2009 at the same community. So the income has increased tremendously over the years, but rural electrification is not the only reason for increasing the income levels. Actually, basically, it catalyzed the livelihood improvement in the area. The second graph on the right, top right, it's the buying capacity. It also improved during this decade. And the top is the asset level of households comparison of 2009 and 2016. Further, the employment data indicated that shift from agriculture activities to the commercial and industrial sector activities, and the share of employment in industry has increased from 55% to 70% during this period. And there are many other factors. Actually, the appliance usage has increased. That shows the basically the convenience of life in their households. And with that, actually, I would like to close since we have very limited time.
Thank you very much, Pali. And now I'd like to call on Shrestha Banerjee to take it home for us. And Shrestha will be looking at some of the lessons drawn from community consultation and social protection programs in the coal transition in India. Thank you, Shrestha.
Thanks, Rihanna, and thanks to ADB. We mentioned in the morning that we are also working with ADB on having a strategic engagement on just transition in India, and we are more than happy to also collaborate with the Melbourne University on this work. I think this panel has largely focused on renewable energy development as a process of just transition, which is important because we are also talking of creation of jobs, creating livelihoods and all of that. But the question, if we focus on gender, remains that how much it will translate to women. Because there are skill gaps, there are education gaps, there are many, many challenges. So I'll start a little bit context of the coal community in India, because the topic that is understanding the challenges of social protection and inclusion. And I'll really focus to that and give a little bit highlight of what can be the broad goals that we are aiming at when we are talking of a just energy transition, and what can be some of the strategies to achieving it. What Kate rightly said in the morning, that there is a conceptual agreement, but how can a concept translate into an action is, I believe, is the biggest challenge. So when we talk of the key issues of social protection and inclusion, I believe there are 5 major things that I would highlight when it comes to gender. The first is that in context of India's coal sector, the biggest challenge is with informality, basically the informal workforce. And it is a huge challenge because the numbers are not very well documented. In fact, in the morning when Chandrabhushan spoke about the subnational district level studies we are doing, it's not just about capturing experiences, but also generating data. So we need to understand that when we plan an intervention, how many people we are talking about. And some quantification, when we do from our subnational studies, we now have come to understand through various assessments, it's that the informal workforce in the coal sector is nearly 2.5 to 3 times. And these can be very conservative estimates still for some of the very old coal regions. So at least, and if I translate it to number, it's anywhere between 0.8 million to 1 million workers we are talking of. And this type of informality is also very varied. One is there is a lot of informal workers who are engaged in the formal coal value chain, for example, coal mining, coal transportation, coal washeries. But
in India, they're in the eastern part of India, there is a lot of old coal mines. In fact, it has about 150 to 200 years of coal history. And coal mining forms an intricate part of social relations in those regions. And there are a large number of old mines which have been abandoned, and people just gather coal from these mines and sell it in the local market to earn a living. And that, in many ways, literature says that it's illegal mining, but we think it's a subsistence economy that has grown around coal in these regions, and it constitutes the informal coal economy. So there is a formal, informal workers in the formal coal economy, and then therefore informal workers in the informal coal economy. And it's a very complex matrix when we are dealing with it. Now, women are largely part of this informal coal economy when we look at the coal mining sector. In fact, we heard that there is in PLN 15%, and I did not put up the statistics, but Coal India Limited, which is the biggest public sector undertaking doing coal mining in India and the public, one of the biggest companies in the world, has only 5% of women in the formal workforce. So that shows that the little participation of women that is present in the coal sector. But I think what is more important, that as these companies plan a transition, there will be very little representation of women who take decisions. And that becomes extremely important. The third important aspect of women and protection when we talk of social protection becomes the laws. Because currently the labor laws are largely protecting the departmental workers, basically, who are having full-time employment with the coal companies, or the contract workers who have a very long-term contract, say 10 years or more. They are protected by various laws and company policies. But there is practically no policy which are targeted towards informal workers, and particularly in the context of an energy transition. What adds to their vulnerability is the poor social and economic indicators of this coal mining regions. And we heard that, how the entire just transition question is aligned to so many of the sustainable development goals. And therefore, if we look into some of the development indicators in this coal region, such as access to healthcare, access to education, access to basic amenities, such as even clean drinking water, many of the coal districts are having 50 to 60% of the population who are not having access to these basic services, which in a combined way we call the multidimensional poverty index. And just to contextualize it, in context of India's situation also, this is twice the India average. India average is about 25% as of 2021, and this is about twice that of that. And finally, the inclusion aspect is about decision making. Yes, not just informing them, but how they can be part of planning process and monitoring and implementing the measures that we are talking of on just energy transition. We only know the forefront of the problem, like when these industries came up, our experience is that there has been very little engagement. So therefore, we really need to be very, very cautious when we plan the future, that how we can engage them. Next. Just a visual, I think, always pictures can capture more than what we speak. And these are some of the pictures from the various subnational work that we do. And I picked up two pictures from two different states. One is Jharkhand, which we all know is a very old coal region having 200 years of coal mining history. And when we talk of women employment in the coal economy, it is not just women who are adults, but also children who have never gone to school or who are drop out of schools to just gather coal. And this is a girl who was working in one of the field studies when we were doing. So basically they pick coal, they put it in the sack, they take back to the family, and the male partner of the family will sell it to the local market. The other kind of worker that is a more, she's an adult woman, she was working in Orissa. It was around a coal slurry area. So they are just mostly doing the cleaning jobs, shoveling things, putting it into somewhere else. So these are kind of the work people are doing. Now, what necessarily this tells is they are very low income wages they are actually in the lowest rung. On an average, the monthly income of an informal worker is about $35. And for women, our experience shows it is even lower, about $25 per month or $30 per month at the maximum. So this is the vulnerability we are speaking of next. Now, in this context, and given the sense of time, there are some of the key goals that we are looking at when we are talking of a just transition processes and trying to particularly protect women in the process. And not just protect, I think we need to also think of how to create a better future. It's not just the transition, but also how do they get engaged in the new economy. So the first and foremost things about mainstreaming gender, and I think it's the most well talked about issue, is mainstreaming gender in just transition policies, plans, and investments, particularly very strategically guiding that towards women. Maximizing the potential of formal jobs for women in the workforce in the low carbon economy. And there is every fear today in the developing world and in India itself that we will create renewable energy jobs, but will the people, the informal workers and the women will end up doing the same kind of menial work that they are part of the coal economy. So that's a clear danger that we need to be cautious about. We really need to ensure equal access of skilling and reskilling programs, because we are talking of an economy where there are caste divisions, there are issues of exclusion based on people's income, people's socioeconomic status. So access becomes an important issue. And also in both in terms of actually skilling and employment, it's not just skilling programs. What I personally think is a lot of investment is necessary in building foundational skills of women and girls, because it also leads to not just what they are given, but what they can choose to do. If you educate someone, if you provide them the right foundational skills, it also helps in their mobility and choices. So this is the investment that, when we talk of investments from multilateral banks, from the developing world, in terms of JETPs, we really need to be careful that this is the welfare investment and this is the kind of funding support that we need in a lot of form of, I think, what is required is grants. And finally, equal and meaningful participation in the planning process and implementation, and not just informing them about what is going to come, but how they can be part of the change and how their aspirations are captured in those plans and policies. The last one. And finally, here's some of the strategy which we can take forward in the discussion. If I break down the strategies as per the focus of the topic, there are two strategies which we really need to adopt. One is strategies for social protection, and one is for community consultation. In terms of social protection, there are three important things that needs to be done. One is definitely the reform of the labor laws to strengthen support for the informal workers and specifically women. Right now, there are certain, social security codes in India that are giving some sort of measures for informal workers, but they are not readily designed around transition. And we have held couple of consultations from labor unions to community groups, and everyone thinks that there needs some fundamental reform for these laws to address the just energy transition. The second thing is about informed just transition policies and investments. And by informed, what I mean is not just being sensitive towards it, but actually having data to guide decision making. How many people will be impacted? What is their income levels? What is the skill training they need? What kind of education investments? So there is a lot of research that needs to be undertaken to actually make meaningful plans and investments. Investments in social infrastructure, as I said, that there is a challenge of development in these regions. Therefore, investments in schools, investments in vocational training, in fact, higher order skills is really important. With respect to community consultation, the most important thing is institutional systems, which are systematic and formal. Because informal processes are very difficult to document what has been their outcome. Therefore, we need a formal mechanism to understand what has been the processes of engagement with women and, mostly the informal workers, how their observations have been translated into actually plans and investments, and how they are benefiting. So we need a full circle system to actually engage community in the process and building stakeholder capacity, because we cannot expect people with these kind of challenges of earning a living or poor education status to just come and plan. It is very difficult for them to fathom a change like this, which is going to happen in the next 30, 40 years, which involves so much of investments. Therefore, educating them, informing them, building their capacity, and through multiple means. I do not think it is in the scope of any few organizations to do it. Therefore, a network and a system has to be built for constant engagement with these people to build their capacity and have their meaningful engagement in the process. And I'll stop to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrestha, for honing in on some of the key gender aspects or at the community and local level in the transitioning coal communities. I'd like the participants here to bear with us to take another 5 minutes into the tea break. If there is one urgent question or important question, we can accommodate that, and something addressed to all our speakers. So it could also be a summary winding up for them. Yes, question? No comments, please, just question.
Okay, I think the previous question that is a little bit addressed to large
Can you
extent.
speak up? Speak up.
Yeah, the question that I put in the last session, that is somewhat covered up by Shrestha. So thank you for that. And I would like to put up a question now. What is the pace of this transformation that Shrestha has put up? And can we match up that pace with the transition that is going to happen at the Lhasa sector?
What is the pace of the transition?
Yes, pace of the transition, pace of the work that Shrestha just put up. Like, it's very important work. How do we keep up that pace with the larger transition going on, larger dialogue going on? So,
all right, I think that's a really important question. That is the pace of the transition. And how do we judge the pace? How do we estimate the acceleration of the pace of that? And I think I'll pose that as the final comment in one sentence to all the speakers, starting with James, and then work down the line. So that is the pace of the transition.
Thanks, Rahana. Actually, when the phase of the transition can be faster when we don't consciously build in something for just, right? It should be built according to what the community actually needs. So then it won't be seen as another interventions we are trying to build as just. It should be a real transition, as I mentioned, to be just. Thank you.
In the Sri Lankan context, it's too early. So basically, we are transitioning on the thermal to the renewables. So our aim is to reach at least 70% of renewables by 2030. So when you're concerned about the employment and other things, I think I don't see a very, very significant impact in this country.
I think Upali already touched on this. I mean, it's a completely new subject for us. I mean, so we haven't even thought of this. I mean, it's not a issue for us at the moment. As I mentioned in my presentation, I mean, coal is imported to Sri Lanka, and oil also imported. We all depends on imports other than the renewables. So, so we are very experienced in having all kinds of renewables, and so it's not a an issue or I mean, it's too early for us to think of that. As I said, even our coal power plant is too young. It's only 10 years old. So it has some useful life, 20 more years to go. And but we have abandoned all new coal power plants, which we had in our long-term generation expansion plan. So we were compelled to remove this. And so we'll be going for a very rigorous renewable energy master plan. And it's in a kind of an energy transition. It's a different kind of energy transition for us. Thank you.
So the pace of the transition, can vary from country to country, depending on, it is also tied to the climate change and the net zero commitments countries have. So not everyone has to do it at the same time, but generally speaking of developing countries and Southeast Asia we are talking of, I think what can put the pace, we can fasten that process is if we have the systems in place first, instead of going in an ad hoc manner, which can create more chaos and misunderstanding. And in fact, it can also lead to protests, because if people do not understand and they are not understanding, and I'm just talking of coal, we are talking of the entire fossil fuel system and the value chain. It's much more than what we just talked about. Therefore, systems putting in place will be very essential for the pace to be on track with the climate change goals. Because then once the systems are put in place, then everyone can replicate it, work it in sync, and fast track the process. And that's the only way, I think, at this point, we can think through that, how we can do this job in the next 30 to 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make brief summary points. I think this has been a very important discussion, and we really need to continue these in different ways as we do the work in this area. It's clear that there is greater conceptual clarity and consensus on the just energy transition. The challenge is implementation. That's absolutely clear, a clear message. I think this is particularly the case for gender equality and social inclusion. And I think in this space, in relation to the just energy transition, we have quite a bit of work to do. And I think this is both at the conceptual level, in terms of what are some of the key pillars and strategies of a GESI inclusive just transition, and of course at the implementation level. And here we have to draw from some of the practice that we already have. And in terms of GESI, our challenge is we have to do both at the same time. We have to get conceptual clarity and we have to address the implementation at the same time. Working with utilities is absolutely critical. And I'm very happy that we've got a utility perspective here, and which is, we were conscious of introducing that in. So we are planning to continue these through what we call lateral learning programs in the South Asia region on a just energy transition, GESI inclusive, both at the country level and sub-regional level as well. So look forward to more information on that. Thank you so much to our speakers for their excellent presentations in session 1 and session 2, and for working under time pressure. Thank you very much, all of you, and fantastic audience for listening so patiently. Thank you.